All right. Another podcast from the Michigan Institute of Athletics in Brighton, Michigan. It's going to be a great podcast today. I'm super excited about this one. I've been looking forward to it. Right before we get into it, I want to shout out VetLife. VetLife is a 501c3 nonprofit company. It's a company of veterans for veterans. Every veteran faces difficulties when they transition from active duty back to civilian life, and VetLife is there to ease that transition. If you'd like to reach out to VetLife, you can do so through Instagram or Facebook, or check out their website at vetlifetoday.org. So without further ado, I'm super excited to introduce you, Amy, and I don't want to steal any of your thunder. So you are the Lieutenant Colonel in the Michigan State Police, which is the Chief Deputy Director.
You got it.
Yeah, I got it right. I didn't mix those up. I was afraid to say Lieutenant Director. And, I'm excited to hear your story. So before we jump into what you are now, I always like to start my episodes with who you were in the beginning. So were you born and raised here in Michigan? And tell me about who you were as a child and what led you into becoming a law enforcement officer.
So I was born and raised in Michigan, northern Michigan, a little town called Au Gres, small, like 900 people small. I graduated high school with 22 people. There's all kinds of jokes there. I've heard them all. Two of them, here's the other jokes. Two of them were my first cousins, so there's even more jokes. But from some of my youngest memories was an athlete. There weren't a lot of opportunities. I had to play baseball. I had to play with the boys. The first organized sport I played was actually Pee Wee football. I was the first girl to play. Which I think back on it now, I was a terrible tight end. I played special teams. I was terrible, but I was fortunate that I came from a basketball background. My dad was a high school basketball player, and fell in love with it, and knew from the time I was in 5th or 6th grade that I wanted to play at a Division I university, and I wanted to play on a scholarship. Which, people told me, "Hey, you're crazy. You're wasting your time." But I was fortunate, got a scholarship, went to Temple University, which is in your neck of the woods in Philadelphia, right? And spent 4 years there, 4 incredible years, traveled the country, got a great education. And then when I graduated from college, I didn't really, like a lot of people, didn't really know what I wanted to do. And my bachelor's degree is in sports marketing, which, coming back to Michigan, not a lot of opportunities to use that degree. So I went to work in public relations for a real small hospital, and immediately knew, after about a year and a half, I'm like, I can't do this the rest of my life. I can't sit behind a desk, and felt like I wasn't contributing. So I was married at the time, and my husband had come off active duty in the Army about a year before we met. I had always had an interest in the military, had a lot of family that served, but I wasn't positioned to go in, in lieu of college, because I wasn't going to give up an athletic scholarship. And so at the time, there was a couple of competing interests that I had. I had a family friend who had just retired from the Michigan State Police. And I got talking to my husband one night, and he said, "Well, if you want to do something different, do something different. What do you want to do?" I said, "Well, I always had an interest in the Army." But what I had done was I had applied to the Michigan State Police in January of 2004, but the state was broke. And I had applied, taken the test, passed the test, and then got a letter the next day that said, "Don't call us, we'll call you. State doesn't have any money, but we'll put you on a list." And so immediately after that, I thought, well, I'm going to join the Army. And I enlisted on August 28th of 2001, so about 2 weeks before 9/11, which, it obviously didn't see 9/11 coming, but I will tell you on the day that the towers came down, I can, like a lot of people, I can remember where I was sitting and watching it happen, and my boss at the time came into this was about a month before I was supposed to ship to basic training, and my then boss came into my office, and she says, "Wow, I bet you regret that decision." And I thought, no, I feel like this is the best decision I've ever made. And then bang, shipped to basic training. AIT, and my husband and I spent the next 4 years kind of traveling all over, going to different schools. I had the opportunity to go out to officer candidate school, and that decision changed my life. And then fast forward 4 years, almost to the day, a recruiter from the state police calls me back in January of 2004 and says, "Hey, your name's still on a list. You interested? We're going to run a school in July." I said, "I'll be there." And 6 months later, July 18th of 2004, I was sitting in a recruit school in Lansing, Michigan.
Wow. So right off the rip, you're a go-getter. And what was it like growing up because I don't want to skip over that because I don't have that experience in such a small community. I mean, you probably know everyone there. Like everybody knows everybody. Actually, our ultra successful female fighter that made it to the UFC, she grew up in Bath, Michigan, and it was like that for her. It was such a small town, like everyone knew it, but she had an extremely strong sense of herself. And it might be like when you're in that small of a community, like you're more of a like there's more identity to you. You're not in an ocean of people. Do you think that was crucial to form? And what was your family life like? Did you have a good, mother, father, good home life? Because I can tell you're a go-getter. You radiate the energy. There had to be some parts from childhood that were like perfect to make that solution.
So I come from a great family. My mom and dad's side, a lot of them still live in or around my hometown. Big, Irish, Catholic, German families on each side, multiple siblings, multiple aunts and uncles, multiple cousins. But from a very early age, my mom and dad, very blue collar. My dad worked in construction until he got hurt. And then I think about this now. He put himself through college when he was probably in his early 30s, had 3 kids at home, had a wife that didn't work. And this is in the early 80s, when nobody had any money. The economy wasn't very good. And I have memories of that, of him driving back and forth. At the time, it was Saginaw Valley. It was a college. It wasn't a university yet. But I think about that now. Like, that guy went to school every day, got a degree in accounting, and somehow still managed to put food on the table. My mom and dad were both really big outdoorsmen. People still joke, like my mom, I can tell you right now, is it 2:00 yet? She'll be in a deer blind in northern Michigan with a crossbow waiting for something to come in. But that's how I grew up. You fished, you hunted, because that's how you ate. But it was work.
So you had an extremely good structure from a young age, and you saw hard work, and you saw these characteristics that would yield success. And you're in a loving home, so you have a good sense of yourself. You can go take on the world, So that's why, you're the girl that went out for Pee Wee football. Because most people, even hearing your story right off the rip, they're like, oh my gosh, I would have never done that. But you had that confidence, like, I can do what I want to do. And that tends to carry people through life. I had a lady on a previous podcast really recently, Carol Sue Reeder, the judge in Michigan that started La Casa for women. And man, she has done incredible things in her lifetime, became a lawyer, became a judge, did all these things. And she related it back to, she had a small, worked on a farm, learned about herself, built some confidence up, and was like, you know what, if I can do this, I can do anything that I set my mind to. And that same belief system kind of carried her into the future. So you join the military, you come out of the military. Was the transition period difficult for you at all? Because I've spoken to so many veterans that somewhere during that transition, when they go from being in the military to out, there's a lot of struggle. There's, and I don't know if you would have coined yourself with any PTSD or trouble coming back into the civilian life. But most people, the way you told the story, it was such a like, oh, and I popped out and I'm right back in the Michigan State. Like, you just crushed it. But that's not the case for most people. Was it difficult when you transitioned out? Or do you think because you came back home to a relationship and you had a career right in front of you and you had an opportunity, was that an easy period of your life?
So that's actually a really good question. For me, most of my time was spent in the National Guard, and I never had the opportunity, well, I shouldn't say that. I never had the opportunity to deploy into combat theater, right? My husband at the time was an infantry officer, and in the 15 years that we were married, he deployed 6 or 7 times. Crazy, but what you would expect from an infantry officer. So did I personally struggle with the transition of coming out of the Army and into the MSP? I did not. The struggle was for myself and my husband trying to reassimilate every time he would come home from a deployment, which I think if you talk to any military spouses, they would probably tell you something similar. And that ebb and flow of trying to reintegrate into a relationship when you've been separated for a year or a year and a half, then compound that with you've got a guy who's gone away into really crazy combat environments, lost men, seen some really horrible things, that men and women see in war, and then come back, try to reintegrate into a quote-unquote regular life with a spouse. That was my struggle with transition.
100%. I mean, he has to turn that fight or flight off and then go back to who he was before he deployed. That's a very difficult thing. So you definitely had to carry some of the weight of that. And you guys are still together to this day?
No, we're divorced.
I was going to say, but
Very amicable, great friends, but just I think that took a toll. Neither one of us really probably properly addressed it, and it just, like anything else, just two people going two different directions.
100%. And it's an extremely difficult thing. And it's something you hear from almost every veteran, that it took such a toll on their relationships. And just because that is I mean, they're in a primal, instinctual survival, be paranoid 24/7, and then come back to like, just be you and like go out there and get it. And you know, every opportunity is in front of you. There is no mission. There's not a direct order, and it's a difficult thing. So then you join Michigan State Police. You come in right as well. Actually, let's not skip over school. What was it like having to go into the cadet school and like train and then get accepted into the Michigan State Police?
So our background process is very lengthy, but deliberately very lengthy, right? We're looking for great people, but in order to do that, we're going to comb through your background with a fine-tooth comb. And there's a lot of really valid reasons that we still to this day do that. But for me, I had applied at 26, like a lot of my peers had applied at 26, but because we had to wait out a 4-year hiring freeze, I was 30 years old. I turned 30 my second week of recruit school, but a lot of my classmates did also. And I will tell you that being 30 and going into a police academy, probably in hindsight, one of the best decisions I could have ever made. I was mature. I had life experience behind me. I was married. I had, been around the block a time or two. I had education. So I look back on it now and I think I'm so fortunate to have come in to policing at a little older age. But the academy for me, I loved it. I loved it. I mean, it was 24 weeks. Ours is a resident academy. You live there Monday through Friday. You report back on Sunday nights, and it the bell goes off at 5 a.m. and it doesn't stop until 10 p.m. when it's lights out. But for me, I love the fact that immediately you noted that the standards were high, the expectations were high, and you didn't get any free passes. The academic portion there, incredibly challenging because as troopers, you're expected to be autonomous. You're going to go out, investigate a crime. You're not going to call a sergeant or a lieutenant and say, hey, sir, hey, ma'am, can I make this arrest? We're going to teach you how to make those decisions yourself. And you think about it, that's an incredible amount of responsibility that you need to be prepared to handle.
100%. And even though it's 24 weeks, that's a lot of information and character building that has to take place in that period. You have to go from a civilian to a protector of civilians and a servant of the civilians for a healthy society. In a 24-week period, there's a lot to learn in there. And you have to get confident enough with that to not just know it, be able to apply it and let people, because people can feel when authority is authentic or when someone really believes in their position and then they're using it versus when it's like overly assertive or lack of confidence is portrayed through. So you go through cadet school. It's awesome. You go right to the road as a trooper. Like, I don't really know the normal process. You start like right when you get hired, you get accepted. What is your life like at that time? You're probably super excited. And then let's talk about how you started to go into policing.
So, in the state police, because we're a resident academy, you're a paid employee of the state of Michigan the day your foot hits the door at the academy, which is a great thing. You're making money, you have health insurance. So for people with families, that's a really big bonus. But at the time when I came in, you didn't know where you were going to work. You would go through about 18, 19 weeks of recruit school before you found out what post you were going to be assigned to. And we only recently changed that in the last 3 or 4 years. Now, if you apply and you get in, you're going to know where you're going before you start recruit school. And part of that was just to reflect modern society, right? People are married. They have spouses. They have spouses that might make more money than them. So we're not uprooting people. But I loved every second of recruit school. My first post was the Mount Pleasant post, which didn't know anything about it. I had grew up in Tawas. I had a house that we had to sell up there and went to Mount Pleasant, rented a place for a couple of years. But that initial post that every trooper gets assigned to is where you learn all of your fundamentals. Everything that you learn in recruit school, you get to apply it now, right? Because you're on the road. but you're assigned a field training officer who's a senior trooper. That first 6 months, you're always with that person or those people, and it is the practical application piece of being a police officer. It's your first contact with actual people and actual circumstances where you're investigating things or going to scenes or, getting inserted into chaos and trying to figure out what's going on. How do I solve this problem? How do we resolve this? So that, and I spent the first 7 years of my career at the Mount Pleasant Post working with a lot of great guys. I was the only woman at the Post, but great experience, learned a lot of great things. And I look back on that time now. My senior officers who trained me, I will point to them as credit how I've gotten to where I've gotten in my career. Those fundamentals that they set for me, even at 30 years old, I wasn't above learning, and I'm not now, but they certainly set the stage for success the rest of my time in MSP.
Yeah, 100%. Those fundamentals, it's funny, even in sports, you were a basketball player. Fundamentals usually are what yield high-level success. When you understand something at the ground level, you can then build on that platform. So like the quality of that first training experience and the quality of probably your first person that you get assigned to is directly going to correlate to the experience for you overall. If you have a phenomenal leader and you have a phenomenal environment to grow in, all the recipe for success is there. You just then have to take it, believe in it, and apply it. So when you first went from civilian to officer now, is that a difficult jump to make? Because it's like because you remember Amy right before you were an officer, and now all of a sudden you're Amy that has to take charge of all these difficult situations. You have to willingly put yourself into these interactions with people that, like we said before the podcast, are probably having their worst day. And yet that's going to be your interaction on a regular basis, right? So what was it like when you first made that transition? And then one thing I want to talk about for sure is like, how do you manage the stress, or like, what do you do to stay focused and stay, healthy mentally when you're constantly dealing with these conflicts and struggles and probably people that are upset to see you versus the normal civilian way?
So, when you look at the fundamental nature of policing, and you and I quickly talked about it before we started this, but oftentimes we're encountering people on their very worst day. For me, the transition wasn't a far leap, and I
Do you think that's from your military experience? You already had like roles of leadership?
a little bit. I think part of it, the bigger part of it, was being an athlete. When growing up as an athlete, and no matter what sport you play, athletics brings structure. There's rules. There's right and left limits. You learn to work as a team. You have a uniform identity. You're all working towards a single goal. If you're doing it right, you're all working towards a single goal. That for me allowed me to integrate into the MSP. It almost felt like, oh, this is where I should be. This is home. Like, why didn't I find this 10 years ago?
I mean, we constantly talk about how important athletics are for children because of those exact reasons. And I mean, it teaches you the social relationships. It teaches you leadership dynamics. It teaches you, like you said, a team environment. That makes sense. Even, I'm sure the military was an important part too, but I always try to tell parents, like, if you really want to build your children for success, make sure they are in team settings, because then you don't only think about yourself. You start thinking about, what do I have to do to make sure that this overall experience is better for us? It makes sense to me perfectly as someone that's been in athletics my entire life, that it's like, yeah, you know what? This is now the team. These are the goals. These are the rules. This is how we work and how we serve, and we move forward. So I actually have a couple questions that I pre-wrote down. Normally I don't write down any questions in advance, but I feel like there's so many things that I wanted to ask you that I didn't want to skip on you. So I'm gonna read some. When you first started MSP and you're entering in at the ground level versus where you sit today, where you're kind of overseeing so much, how has your perspective changed? And like, what would you tell young troopers, young officers, or young prospective people that are considering getting into law enforcement? Because like one of the struggles I believe we're having is in recruitment right now, because of like all the hatred that's been thrown around, and people are like, man, like, I'm not going to do that thankless job. How has your perspective changed over time? And like, what would you tell those young people considering going into law enforcement?
So I don't really know that my perspective has changed much, from a couple of fronts. One, the day I put the uniform on for MSP, I was so incredibly proud, loved putting that uniform on for the first time. And 17 years later, I still love putting that uniform on. I love what it means. I love what I get to represent. I love that there's a lot of other men and women in the department, and I get to be a part of it. The other part is, and now I forgot the question that you asked me.
No, it's just if you were talking to young people that were considering law enforcement, what would you tell those people? Because I can see it right when you started talking about it. You radiate, you love what you do. You love the career choice you made. You love being a part of the Michigan State Police. What would you tell them, if they're considering joining it?
So I would say do it. And you're right. I mean, it's not specific to MSP, but policing, law enforcement in general right now is facing a recruiting crisis. It just on its face doesn't appear to be an appealing way to spend a career. I will tell you, like any other job, there are good days and bad days. But what people don't understand about this job is that I challenge you to find something that's more fulfilling. Certainly places to go and make more money, get more accolades or things like that, or be able to get, other material things as a result of your job or your status. But, when you bring closure to a victim or their family, or you save a life, or you help bring a life into this world, there is nothing like it. And I challenge someone to come up with a career where you can have such a positive impact. I've had friends that are engineers, doctors, lawyers who left their jobs to become police officers, and because they weren't fulfilled. And there's probably things that are safer to do. Certainly, that this profession is inherently dangerous. And we teach people, we give them the skills to deal with those risky situations, but I don't care where you're at on the planet. I challenge you to find something that's going to be more fulfilling.
100%. And as a coach, I mean, it's servicing or serving others. When you give to other people or you try to make the world a better place for the people around you, it fulfills you. That's what I try to tell people. Like, if you're unhappy with your life, try to make other people's lives better. Try to live in a way that you put out energy that helps the people around you, and see if that doesn't help you. So it's like you're doing a direct relation to that statement. You're going around and trying to give your best to uphold this idealistic standard in your mind that sometimes you may fall short of, but you're like, you know what? We are trying to be this benevolent thing. And by doing so, you are directly impacting the lives of people around us. And it's like, for as much as you might be encountering someone on their worst day, it might be the best day of their life if you saved their life from an incident. If they were going to be a victim of a terrible crime, you could be like, how many times have you heard stories about, the officer that saved someone's life? We just don't tend to remember that as much as the officer that shot somebody in a bad incident, So a couple other questions that I had was, there is a lot of demand right now for like reform and change and defund the police. And like I said, even before the podcast, we were talking for a minute, like all cops are bastards. I got on a video podcast with a girl that I actually respect. She's the wife of someone that I've been friends with for a long time. This is the only podcast I've ever done that I didn't even post, because she was defending that and trying to make that valid. And obviously she was very emotional about some of the incidents that were going on in society and what the news was putting out. But she was basically trying to push that, like, all cops are bastards. And I'm like, okay, I don't believe you to be a bad person, but, like, why are you believing this? Like, you're the most loving, you care about people, but you're trying to push the idea that all cops are bastards, which is the biggest stereotype ever. My cousin Shane was my best friend growing up. My best friend. I love the dude. He's a phenomenal husband. He's a father to his child. He's a great man. He's a Philadelphia police officer. You know what I mean? And I brought up to her, and I go, like, that's like one of the best people I know. Is he a bastard? And her response to me was like, well, the only reason that bad cops can exist is because good cops don't do anything about it. So there's these people believing that, like, there's a systemic problem within policing that needs to be addressed. So with you have all these people calling for reform, calling for change, recruitment numbers are going to be way down. What does the Michigan State Police and other departments have to do to start to shift that ideology, or like just get people back to, like, when I grew up, we thought police were great. I remember as a really little kid, at one point in time, I was like, I want to be a police officer, because you looked up to those people. You looked up to police and firefighters and military, and the culture is like shifted.
So You're right. I mean, we've certainly been in a number of these conversations the last year and a half, and from my seat, the seat I sit in now, where I'm in a leadership position and I'm at a higher level over the department, I certainly see the struggle that some of our young men and women, or even our veteran troopers who are out there every day, the struggles that they face. But here's what I'll say about law enforcement and where we're at as an industry, and I think every industry goes through this at some point, right? The calls for reform or whatever they are to do better. I don't disagree with all that. I have never once thought that our industry was without fault or was flawless, and I challenge you to find somebody who would say that. But I think if you're really genuinely leading something, you have to take stock of that. Look at where you are as an industry, where you are as an individual, and where you want your profession to go. I think modernization in law enforcement, long overdue. Certainly the way we train our people, the way we train them to respond to societal crisis needs to adapt. But that's like anything, right? If you're not advancing, if you're not finding different ways to learn, if you're not challenging your people to embrace non-traditional things, I would tell you you're probably not doing your job as a leader. But for those people who are averse or maybe not interested in joining law enforcement because of all the stuff that's going on around it, I would tell you now is the best time. You want to get in on an industry that is changing, that there's a lot of opportunity for growth and progression. This is the best time to get in.
You're saying all the hot buttons too. I mean, if you're a leader and you believe in stagnation, I don't know if you're a leader. Like, the point is constant evolution. The point is progress and growth. And even from the founding documents, a more perfect union. Even if things are good, we should be working to say, how do we make them better? How can we go to the next level? Because our understanding today is far different than our understanding was 10 years ago, which is far different from what it was 50 years ago. So over time, as long as we have that leadership that is looking at things objectively and saying, hey, let's acknowledge what we do well. Let's not forget about that, because then you don't have a sense of pride. You don't have, you don't even have a belief in your system. If you try to say that, all this is terrible, well, then there's not even a platform to grow from. But when you acknowledge what is good and you say, well, these are the areas we're going to focus on, that's where the growth is going to happen. And like you said, if you're one of those new candidates, that's how you be a part of change. That's how you help move the needle in the right direction. That's how we get to a society that once again looks at their police as a great part of community. You know what I mean? I tend to find that even through my own life experiences, when I was much younger and dead broke and had not a dime to my name trying to chase my dream, I ran into more issues. My license plate would be expired, and then I would get pulled over, and then next thing you know, this was a ticket, and then, you know what I mean? And it's and of course I was I hated that interaction. But when you look at things objectively, and I look now, I'm thankful to have police in my community. There's an army of them that train here, but emotions can cloud things, and we have to get back to the truth of it. Policing is a great thing in society because there are people that can't defend themselves. There are people that need help. There are people that I'm not going to name who the gentleman was because I don't want anyone to get mad at him. But on a recent podcast, we had a guy that's the most anti-police guy I've ever interviewed in a long period of time. He was extremely anti-police. He hates the thin blue line flag. He thinks it represents oppression and all these things, and it bastardizes the American flag and all these things. And I go, and we made progress together because I said, don't you think that the people that might fly that thin blue line flag are thinking of their father, their grandmother, their friend, their daughter that's a police officer with love in their heart, being you know what, my family member is out serving that community. It's a symbol, and they're looking at that as we appreciate that. Just as you might think of the terrible incident that did happen in your community or a bad experience that you had with a police officer, and now you're looking at that symbol and you're carrying all those feelings. We need to get away from that and get back to the truth of things. And the truth of things, policing done right is a wonderful thing. It's a good thing for society. So one of the things that I wanted to ask about too is mental health issues in the policing department has been kind of a hot topic, or it's a very difficult struggle, mental health and policing. And that might be because you're in a kind of a thankless job at time, and you are meeting people on their worst day, and you're getting a shifted perspective in life, and you probably have to be more paranoid on a regular basis than an average person. That next person you stop just for speeding could try to take your life from you. So what is the leadership of Michigan State Police doing to try to address the mental health side of policing now knowing what we do?
So this is a huge thing. You nailed it. And it's not just specific to the state police. If you went into any law enforcement agency in the country, they'd tell you the same thing. That's probably top on their list is the mental health of the members of your department. And certainly even at a high level, you're not immune to getting sucked into some of those things. I mean, you were talking just a minute ago about all the negativity that's out there and how you get caught up in it. And I physically, as a leader, have to stop routinely through a work week and say, the majority of people out there are great people. They want law enforcement in their community. They want to be served. And they're the same people that are dropping food off at our posts, random strangers who are bringing in baked goods and sending letters. And even in cases where their family members have been arrested, they're sending thank you letters to troopers. Hey, thank you for doing the right thing. This person, has kind of run afoul of things for a while, and thank you for handling it professionally, right? And so you have to remind yourself sometimes that is the majority of people, and that's not to say that you're going to ignore the minority, because I think they have a voice, and it's important. It's important to listen to them and to be an informed consumer of the people that you serve. But the mental health piece, for us in the state police specifically, we are so fortunate to have a team of psychologists embedded in our department, and they serve our members, they serve our members' families, and they are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And that, when I tell other agencies that, other police officers that is like our flagship. That is one of the single biggest things I am so proud of in our agency, because other agencies don't have that. But for us, you need somebody to talk to at 2 a.m. We have a very talented team of individuals whose sole purpose it is to address your mental well-being. We've invested a lot of money in the last year in it. We stood up an entirely new area of the department that is dedicated to wellness and resiliency. Matter of fact, we're having interviews this week and hiring people. So we made it a priority.
That is incredible, because the healthier psychology you have in your officers, the better interactions you're going to have with the people. If you have an officer that has been struggling and over and things are getting worse and worse, stacking up, there can be an implosion or explosion point. And having them know that, like, hey, first of all, it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to talk about that, like, man, I am struggling. And we have a support system in place to thank you or to help you for this service and make you more effective at doing it. You know what I mean? That's massive. I feel like back in the day, it was always just tough it up, like rub dirt on it. Like that was the mentality. That really was. That was the mentality we grew up with. Oh, your leg's broken? Like rub some dirt on it. And then, you find out your leg's broken. But like we are now starting to make it a priority with people to say, hey, we have to make sure these people are in good headspaces, because when you, like I said, if you have someone in a bad psychology, you are just, it's more of a recipe for disaster. So MSP is like leading the way on that. That's phenomenal. Now, are you only considering forms of like therapy through like just talking to someone, or do you have other things that you've found either for yourself or within the department that helps people cope? Because I think therapy works for some people, like just the flat out dialogue, but I think some people have to do things or be are there any other methods that you're looking into?
So there's several things. We also have a peer support program where it's just peer to peer. It's trooper to trooper, sergeant to sergeant, or command officer, which is really more of an informal structure. But when you're talking about kind of integrating some of the other pieces in, physical pieces, where now we brought back our PT test. For years we weren't doing one. Which I think really did us a disservice. I think you have to constantly challenge your people and set a standard that they can continuously chase after. So part of it, I think, is the physical piece. People laughed about this when we did it. We brought yoga into our academy. We now offer it as part of a curriculum and regular training that we do. And of course, at first we got a lot of eye rolls, but when people showed up for the class, their mindset was immediately changed when they saw, "Ooh, this is hard." But you leave there feeling like, "Ooh, I cleared my mind. This is a very different way to level set things." So I think for us, you have to balance all of those pieces. The good space that we're in is no idea is a bad idea. Throw it out. If we can figure out how to put a curriculum around it and how to present it to all of our members, we're going to give it a shot.
That's wonderful because you're an athlete. You know how important it is to exercise and take care of your body and just release the endorphins in your brain. And you know what I mean? And if you're not doing these things, your perception of the world can get worse. You're not getting chemicals that you need. You're not taking care of yourself. And if you're not taking care of yourself physically, the whole quality of your life tends to slowly decline. So it's great to hear that you brought back PT. It is great to hear that you're challenging people with yoga. We have yoga next door, and I did the same thing. I was doing yoga on the other side of Brighton. I was going on the weekend mornings, and I was like, you know what? These fighters that are stereotyping against, I don't want to do yoga. If I could just get them in there and shut off their mind for an hour, like forget about the outside world for an hour, focus on stretch your body, move, breathe, and like calm the craziness, right? Like just take a deep breath. It'll be so beneficial. And now it's like I said, it's the door next to us. And it's the same thing, but I got the same when you were describing it, the same like, oh, you want me to do yoga?
Oh, yeah.
You know, it's because there's just like a connotation around it that's not correct. You know, but the more that we offer these services, maybe that only helps, let's say 3% of officers stick with it. That's still 3% that you've now given something very healthy to cope with a very stressful career. And maybe some people work with the therapist and that works well. And maybe some people lift weights. And the more services we can provide and say, hey, we want you to be at your best, because if you're best, you can be closest to the standards that we set. And the closer we are to these standards, the better that the citizens of the community will be thankful for our service. You know what I mean? So it's just such a good cycle, and it's great to hear what the Michigan State Police are doing. So one of the things I wanted to talk about too is what type of person, you know, do you look for in the state police? Because there is a recruiting thing. What are you looking for in a human being beyond like physical characteristics? Because obviously, you know, you have to be a certain level, right, physically. But I don't even mean that. I mean, like when you are looking at the human being in front of you, what is the process that you go through to try to identify that, like, yes, this person will make a good candidate for the Michigan State Police? Because I feel like that initial selection process is probably crucial to your final results. But how do you navigate that?
So I get this question all the time, and it's a great question. What are you looking for, right? Because usually where I find myself in a conversation is the way the conversation starts is I will encounter someone that says, well, I don't want my son or daughter, husband or wife or uncle or niece or not. I don't want them being a police officer. And I say, okay, well, that's fair in this environment. I think that's very fair. But are they good people? Well, yeah, they're good people. Are they smart? Are they driven? Do they have integrity? Are they service oriented? Well, yeah. And I say, oh, that's fair. So that's what your loved one possesses, right? That's their skill set. Yep. So if you don't want that person being a police officer, who do you want being your police? And then they kind of look at you like, oh, well, yeah, you're right.
100%.
So that's who we're looking for. There is no specific type, and I think years ago, you know, well before I got into the state police or policing in general, I think they were looking for a specific type of person, right? Today, you got to have somebody that's smart, that can think on their feet, that can write, that can communicate. That's probably the biggest skill a police officer needs. Can you communicate? And are you service-oriented? Are you willing to put yourself or others in front of yourself? And if you're a yes to any of those, you'd make a great police officer.
That's really important. And like you said, the communication skills. I mean, as a professional fighter, I'm not the stature of a professional fighter. I'm a smaller guy. But like just the way that I'll handle myself in any tense situation, I've almost never gotten into fights outside of the competition because I have very good social skills. I can articulate myself well. I can speak to people in a heated exchange without getting heated. And that comes from the training. Right? Like, because, I mean, I fought so many days on a regular basis with people trying to strangle me and trying to physically harm me that, like, it shut off a lot of that fight or flight response, especially in, like, a normal environment where I know that the average threat is so much lower than what I'm experiencing on a regular basis. But with that being said, it's the social skills that protect you. It's not the actual physical. It's not the fact that I may or may not have a weapon. It's the ability to look at the human being across from me and know how to guide that conversation to calm it down. And that's a tough skill to learn. And that's something that it probably takes a little bit of time with the troopers. Because, like, especially if they, if they're trying to just take charge and someone is lashing back at them and it just like, that's probably a difficult thing. What do you think are the key elements to training troopers that want to, put communication first? They want to put the person first.
So in our profession, and it's MSP, any agency, a lot of people think that it's about the brawn, right? It's about the push-ups and the pull-ups and how fast can you run and how great of a shooter are you and in your defensive tactics, how proficient are you, which you absolutely need all of those things, and you need proficiency in all of those. There's no debate there. But the skill, and if you went out and asked anybody in our agency, the skill that they used in any seat that they're in our agency every day is communication. Can you be compassionate, right? That is the biggest one. Can you be compassionate? And that isn't taught in push-ups, pull-ups.
That is massive. Even from inside the department or outside the department, no matter where you sit listening to this dialogue, you have this woman saying, we want them to be compassionate. If you have the police officer not thinking about, like you said, if they're thinking about their push-ups and their defensive tactics, and if you try to do that, I'm going to harm you. If that's the forefront of the brain, it's almost like you're looking for those things versus, no, first, I'm going to try to handle this professionally. I'm going to try to handle this like, what if this was my friend's son? What if this was my brother? What if this was my grandfather? You would definitely extend that compassion first. You would try to have some understanding, and you would try to make the best result possible of this situation. And don't get me wrong, like one thing, we don't live in this utopia where sometimes bad people have to go to jail. Yep. Sometimes you might have to tackle a suspect to the ground. Sometimes things might elevate. But I think what you're saying here is the goal is to always handle it as professionally and peacefully as possible while being highly skilled in the other areas. In case, God forbid, you have to use those things, right?
Yeah, so the examples that you gave, no matter who you're interacting with, that is somebody's brother. It's somebody's grandfather. It's somebody's daughter, family member. Somebody out there loves that person, and although that person's having a bad day, that doesn't give you a pass on you being a good person. In this line of work, the thing that sets great police officers apart is their ability to balance any situation, right? No matter what the circumstances are, can you resolve it with, and you're right, sometimes people do have to go to jail. That's just, that doesn't make them a bad person. Sometimes good people make bad decisions. That's the bottom line. Where we see it, one of the really small ways that we see it, and if you ask people in our department, they would all tell you the same thing. We don't, if you look in our patrol cars, we don't have cages, right? There's an opening to the back seat. There's no plexiglass barrier. There's no bars, nothing. So when you arrest someone, they're either sitting in the front seat in handcuffs, seat belted next to you, or they're sitting in the back seat if you're working with a partner. And we never have problems with people. Rarely. I mean, there's like a 0.5% out there where you'll have somebody that, even despite your best efforts, they want to get a little squirrely on you. But other police are always astounded. Oh, you don't have cages in your car. Don't you have trouble? No, we don't. When you're in custody, and we'll even have people that are in custody, they peek in the back of the car before we put them in. They say, there's no cage in here. Yeah, we don't need one. Do you need a cage? But that little simple act, I think, is its own type of de-escalation for us. People remark all over the country, I can't believe you guys don't have cages. Yeah, we don't need them. We don't. And we get a very different type of response from people when they're in that car. And I think part of it has to do with that visual deterrent of having a cage.
100%. I mean, it's a funny thing on the internet, but you ever see the two dogs that are barking at each other a lot, and then the gate slowly opens up and they're just like, you know what I mean? You don't need to dehumanize someone and show this cage setting stuff, especially if you have them in handcuffs and you've taken control of the situation and you're highly skilled and highly trained and confident at what you do. That's like, it's radiating an energy of confidence out that will help de-escalate things. Like I said, generally the reason I haven't had to ever hurt someone is because there's just a confidence in a certain setting that makes someone go, yeah, you know what? We'll just bring this down a notch. Let's just talk it out. And that's a good thing. And that's powerful. I think that comes from training. It comes from procedures, and it comes from processes. And like you said, having the confidence to do that. While other police officers are like, no way, absolutely not. I need to be. Do you really though? Didn't you have to arrest that person at first? Are you lacking those skills that bad? We need to set the standards. And the other thing that I love about the Michigan State Police is that you are trying to achieve this high gold standard. I have an elite team in this building. Actually, Sergeant Roger Craig talks about it all the time. He's like, man, your elite program. We hold them to like so much harder standards than all of my other fighters. We check they have to make a certain amount of trainings every single week. They have to work with a nutritionist. They have to work with a strength and conditioning coach. They get held responsible for what they'll post online, for what they'll wear in their promo videos. They have to show up to fight day in a suit. You have to show up in a suit and presenting yourself professionally, because and what happens with these people is they start to view themselves as that standard, and they start to hold each other accountable. They start to look around and go, you know what? I can bring the best out of this person, and they're going to bring the best out of me. And by having this, like, we are the best, it brings the entire culture to that. And I feel like it's easier to get people to buy in. If your troopers know that you are invested in, like, we're going to be the gold standard, they're going to want to work harder to live up to that standard, versus if you just let things go and you don't hold them accountable and everything is just a slap on the wrist. Now the whole culture would suffer.
So we get into this conversation a lot when we have recruits first get into a recruit school, because sometimes they don't know, especially if they're young, 21, 22, that's young. They get in there and they don't really know what to expect, and it can be very challenging mentally for them. And we always have to remind them, hey, if this were easy, if this job were easy, if this training experience were easy, we would just give you the badge and let you go, right? It's not for everybody. But the point that you hit about high standards, and that is, after 104 years in our agency, it's who we are. I mean, people certainly, they recognize our cars, they recognize the bubble on top, they recognize our uniforms, but when you suit up in MSP, there is a certain expectation on how you're going to behave, right? How you're going to respond to the public, how you're going to treat a situation, how you're going to show up, and you no doubt are going to be in control of that situation. And instilling that in your people and constantly revisiting it doesn't mean that we're perfect in it all the time. We're always trying to set the bar a little bit higher, but you have to remind people when times are tough or somebody steps out of line and they get held accountable, you have to remind yourself, or go back to the conversation of, you can talk about high standards or you can actually have them. I want to have them. The people in our agency want to have them. So it's constantly setting that bar higher. The next generation, when I'm long gone out of the state police, I hope that the next generation behind me comes in and just continues to push, make the profession better.
Proudly carries that flag, carries what you guys worked to create. One of the things I was talking to my cousin Shane about, the officer in Philadelphia, is he said there's been some struggles within the judicial system where they're not prosecuting people enough, unfortunately, because like he'll have people that are repeat offenders over and over and over that keep getting back out, or maybe it's even a case of like treatment. Maybe these people need things in their life and we're not providing whatever it is, to the point where they finally murder people. He was telling me that Philadelphia is on track to have like one of the worst years for murder that they've had in a long period of time, and it's because the judicial system is like not prosecuting people. Are we experiencing that here in Michigan? What does the overall scene look like, and do you run into any problems? Because like, although you can enforce the laws, you're only a part of the process. You know what I mean? You're basically turning people over to the judicial system and then hoping that resolution comes of this. Do you run into struggles there? Are we running into? Is Michigan doing a pretty good job? Is there a good balance between the policing and the judicial system in the state?
So, I don't know that we have that problem in Michigan. I think as a police officer, you have to know your part in the process, right? It is my job to go out and enforce the laws of the state. Prosecutors, judges have their own very important parts. The entire system, and we got into this, we discussed this for a year and a half. The entire system, I think what we're seeing is there's parts of it that are getting overwhelmed because we're just trying to do too much, especially when you get into the topic of mental health and responding to somebody who's in the middle of a mental health crisis. Oftentimes for us as police, that's where we see systems get overwhelmed, understandably, right? I think areas, states, governments, municipalities struggle with what is the appropriate amount of resources, right? In this particular environment, I think you see a lot more of people in mental health crises just because of the pandemic, the economy, just all of the craziness going on. So I don't necessarily know that we have that issue in Michigan, but I think as a police officer, from one of the very first early lessons you're taught is it's your job to enforce. If you have meet all the elements, you have probable cause, you make the arrest. Really, it's not past that. It's someone else's job, and you have to recognize that, because sometimes what does happen is you may make a great arrest, you have a case, and the prosecutor, for whatever reason, he or she just doesn't think that you have enough to charge somebody. That happens quite a bit. That is their professional decision, and that's one of the reasons that they're in the seat that they're in, and that's how the system is designed to work.
Makes sense. It's just a different avenue. And just like we're trying to reform policing, or we're not trying to reform, we're trying to make it its gold standard. We're probably trying to work to that direction in the judicial system, hopefully. So one of the things I want to talk about is you have this phenomenal program in place, the training school, the standards, the Michigan State Police. What is done on the follow-up for training those? So let's say for 24 weeks, you do a phenomenal job. You live in there. You eat, sleep, breathe this. Now, once you become a trooper, what is the training like? Like, let's say even if I gave you my absolute best for 8 hours a day and you train with me for 24 weeks, I could get you to be decent at martial arts. I could make you a decent boxer, kickboxer. In theory, it's a very, because in the actual perspective of life, that's a super short period of time. So even if I gave you my absolute best, you're still a fragment of what you would be if you trained for 3 years. If you train consistently for 5 years, if you kept those standards that you maintained at this level for 10 years, you'd be universes beyond that point. What happens after the initial training? What is the follow-up training protocols?
So that's a great question. And I'll be super frank. That is something we as an agency in the state police have struggled with. We spend an incredible amount of time, an incredible amount of money in our trooper recruit school. And I would tell you, the product we turn out of our recruit schools, I'd put it up against anybody in the country. We train our recruits better than anybody. Now, when they get out of a school is where I think historically we could do better. And we just spent about $6 million standing up an entire bureau dedicated solely to post-recruit school training. Because at some point, you are going to be a sergeant, or maybe you want to be a sergeant, you want to lead troopers, or maybe you want to be a command officer and you want to run a post in this state. What do we do to help those people be good supervisors, be good leaders? We've got a civilian component in the MSP that does a lot to support other law enforcement agencies. What are we doing for those people? And when you look yourself in the mirror and the answer is, well, we're not really doing a lot, you got to do something different. And in our line of work, that takes money. You got to make an investment in the development of your people. And it took us a while to get there, but about 8 months ago, we stood up an initiative and made it a priority to develop our people after they graduate.
That is so good to hear, because like I said, the whole time I'm thinking, okay, 24 weeks, let's say you were in the best thing in the world. It's still nothing. If you're going to be an officer for 15 years and you did 24 weeks of training, it's like you almost have to develop some sort of program that keeps that growth, that progress, that spirit and energy that you had in that recruit school. Because like your eyes lit up when you talked about it. You're like, I loved recruit school. It's like, but if we could keep a system in place that continued the development on our like I said, no matter if I was the best coach on planet Earth, if I only trained you for 24 weeks, and even a mediocre coach trained you for 2 years, you're going to be better with 2 years of training.
Yeah.
So we have to consider that. We have to look into that. It's like, anything in life, the more experience you have and the more training you do, the more successful you're going to be. So that might be a huge field of, like if you already, let's say you're hitting 95% of what you do in a recruit school and there's a little room for growth, you could be a little better, but there's a massive, you're doing 5% of what we could after. It's like if we pour the attention in that area, it could be tremendous. One of the things that I found difficult over the years is I've had so many law enforcement officers come in here and train, and usually their combatives are extremely basic, unless they wrestled growing up, fought, or were in high level military. Their ability to control a suspect is actually incredibly basic. And I mean no disrespect by this, but like even an average decent high school wrestler usually throws around the officer, or anyone that's trained jiu-jitsu for a period of time can almost like at will submit these people. But in a profession where it's like so crucial, why do you think there's not more hand-to-hand combat style training? And I don't mean in like to hit someone, to hurt someone. I'm not talking about like teach your guys how to box. You don't want to knock a suspect out. But I'm talking about like if someone tries to harm you, the ability to physically control them. Because if you have to last resort, you're going to have to shoot them. If I attack you and you cannot physically stop me from harming you, you have to then resort to a weapon stopping me, right? So with that being said, to me, sitting on the outside, it would seem like one of the most crucial things to do would be to prepare the people for if a suspect grabs you, if this type of training. But I almost never see it. Like I said, I don't mean this in any way disrespectful, but we have troopers that'll come in and they get absolutely thrown around by someone that, they could easily beat with some training.
So a couple of thoughts on that. One, I think like anything that we do, everything is a perishable skill, right? It doesn't matter if it's firearms. It doesn't matter if it's driving, if it's report writing. If you're not doing it with a fair amount of frequency, it stands to reason that it's going to be a skill set that erodes or it gets rusty. And depending on where you're at in the department or what your assignment is, the fact that you're just not getting a lot of hands time in the subject control continuum, which is the system that we operate off of statutorily in Michigan, that it stands to reason that you're probably going to have people that might not be comfortable putting their hands on people. Now, the other thing I will say is that's the feedback that we would get from our department routinely. And one of the reasons that we invested in development was we probably should be spending more time with people behind the wheel at our drive track, with people doing first aid. We have an incredible number of people, and our first aid program has rapidly advanced under some really high-speed troopers the last few years. But it stands to reason that we probably should be getting more reps in first aid, probably should be getting more reps in scenario-based training. Same thing for our defensive tactics, which is the name of the program where our people get into any type of hands-on contact. The other thing I will tell you is the amount of times that someone has to put their hands on somebody is actually incredibly low. So now you're trying to strike this balance of high risk, low use, high risk. So for us, it's trying to strike that balance of what is the appropriate number of reps? What is the right amount of training to give to somebody who may go 5, 6, 10 years, never put their hands on somebody? How do you strike that balance to make sure that they're proficient? I was a DT instructor, and I could tell you I wish we trained 20 hours a week. One of the struggles is because we don't have a lot of people, somebody's got to be out there taking 911 calls.
100%. That makes sense. And I like to think of it as like there should be lines of defense. Like it's actually the same way I teach people how to like grapple and stuff. There's like, if you have to physically put your hands on someone, that should be over having to tase them, which should be over having to do something else, which should be over having to shoot them. So like all of these things should be kind of lumped into one thing. Like as soon as an altercation is no longer just communication and like, I give you an order and you obey. Like as soon as it goes beyond that point, I feel like an officer that is much more proficient and confident that like if I have to take control of this suspect, I can do so without higher level uses of force is going to be less likely to go down that chain. Because the number one thing that I think has caused all this division and hatred and anger and media sensationalization and all this stuff is when a police officer has to shoot someone. And a lot of these times, in my opinion, I believe that these shootings they might not have to take place had the person had a much higher level of training in the physical skills to not have to resort to. Because like if you're scared life or death and you're like, it's me or this person, and you have this weapon between you two, I think it comes down to like, I don't think these people are like, I want to take this person's life from them. But you're in a horrible situation that has escalated extremely. And if you don't feel confident to handle that, you're more likely to resort to something like that. You know what I'm saying? So I think, obviously, shooting skills are super high. You might get in a shootout, but that's got to be lower than what you would be in. Someone might grab a hold of you. Like there's a lower chance that you're in a shootout than that. And then there should be, so it's like lines of it. And hopefully if we could improve that first level, you know what, if you have to grab a suspect, but you can neutralize them in 5 seconds because you have jiu-jitsu training or wrestling or grappling experience, you can neutralize them quick, then hopefully the never's never going to exist, but hopefully we can be not as often having to go further down the lines. Would you agree with that?
So to some extent, I would agree with it. Yeah, and the system that you talk about, the kind of system of levels, we do have in Michigan. The Michigan Commission on Law Enforcement Standards, MCOLS, is the one who establishes just exactly what you just said. The very first step is officer presence, verbal direction. That means I show up on the scene, tell you to stay in your car, or tell you to stay back, or that. In 99% of the time, that's all it takes. And then as you go through, the next one is, you might have to put your hands on somebody. The next one is, you might have to use your taser. You might have to use your OC spray. You might have to use your baton.
So you already have that. That makes sense. And it's actually wonderful to because any logical person, that's how you should look at it. It should be systems, and it should be, we do everything that we can to control it in this system and be as proficient as possible here. And then if it falls out of that system, we should go to this system, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And is it just that we're seeing these shooting cases get always magnified, or like, what is the statistic? Like, how many people get shot by police each year? Do you know?
So I think it depends on what data set you look at.
Like if I pull up the FBI website, do you, or even just a rough number?
So the FBI tracks use of force, which it can mean a variety of different things from state to state. The number of officer-involved shootings every year, I don't even know that number off the top of my head.
Do you know what use of force is? Even just an approximate in the nation. Like, what is it?
I honestly don't know. I should know because I feel like I look at those data sets all the time. But depending on, like, I know a number of universities have done studies the last couple of years. University of Michigan did one. University of Maryland did one. And they get into all types of analytics on demographics and geography and time of day and all that crazy stuff. I think one of the things that we see in this environment is heightened scrutiny on any use of force, right? In this, and it's to be expected. In this era of cell phones or, surveillance cameras everywhere, I think we see it caught on video more. I don't know that there are more uses of force or instances of use of force than 10 years ago, but I think we're seeing it more because it's captured on video more.
Well, is that then bringing to light a problem within the system to some degree? Because, like, for a period of time, police brutality was openly talked about, and I thought we've come, like, a significant way forward from it because, like, you've seen some cases, I'm sure, where police just beat the shit out of someone. You know what I mean? And you're saying, like, well, we're just kind of seeing it more now, but it's always existed? Or do you, because I feel like we've gotten better as a society to not do these things as much, but I don't really know. I don't see the inner world like you do.
So, I wasn't a police officer 20 or 30 years ago. I personally feel, and I can only speak for my agency, that we have gotten our use of force and all of the systems and training around it have gotten so much more refined than they were because we just didn't have resources 20 or 30 years ago. It was very limited. I mean, you were given your academy training, and you really didn't have any refresher after that. When you get into all of the tools now that our troopers have, even taser recertification, that's every couple of years for us. But just because that's our standard doesn't mean it's everybody's standard. But I will tell you that I think law enforcement is in a far better place now with all of those pieces than we were 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, it doesn't seem like it because of the environment that we find ourselves in. It doesn't mean that we can't do a better job and continuously bump the bar, but I still would tell you that policing now is in a better place than it was 20 years ago.
That makes sense. And I'm really, after this podcast, I'll look up the statistics on like use of force things and stuff. Because like I said, the news wants to paint an agenda that the police are just going out there and terrorizing communities and we should completely reform them. They're talking about defund them. I saw people celebrate when the Minneapolis Police Department was burned to the ground. And I thought, like, is this America? Is this where I grew up? Do I live in the same place? Like, are we celebrating that? And I think that comes from like trying to create stories in people's head that are not real. Like, overall, I don't think anyone would argue that the majority of police interactions with people are nonviolent. They're not brutal. They don't involve deaths and tasing. But it's just those don't get your attention. That's not where the focus is. The focus goes to those horrific events that I think you would be as against. I don't want to fully discuss the George Floyd incident because it was very emotional for a lot of people. But like, what were your opinions when you watched that video? For as little or as much as you'd want to say, because like you're someone that's looked at through the lens of like knowing what the training is like, knowing what procedures are like, knowing, the fears that a police officer has on how a situation can get out of hand. Like you see it from the inner world, but you probably also can understand it from the outside world.
For me as a police officer, my first feeling, and it's probably still a valid feeling today, that was a blatant disregard for life, plain and simple. Just I don't know any other way to describe it. I think that was embarrassing for police all over the country. And people can say whatever they want about background and all of that crazy stuff, but for me, as somebody who
It's still a
wears the
human being.
uniform, yeah, that is still a person. But any of the circumstances around it, that's just a blatant disregard for life. Period.
I'm glad to hear you say that, to be honest, because when I watched that incident, I just couldn't make sense of it. I couldn't make sense of like why, whether you believe the man or not when he was saying you can't breathe, whether no matter what you were trying to do, I just couldn't understand why. It looked like a bully torturing someone. It looked to me on the outside almost like a form of torture, because I'm like, I can't understand the process of why that's taking place. You have a helpless person now that's handcuffed. They're not a threat to you. They don't have a weapon, but you're continuing to do what you're doing. It doesn't make sense to me. It's great to hear you, and I'm sure a lot of people that listen to this are going to feel very good to hear you say, like, listen, that was blatantly like the opposite of what we stand for. That would be a nightmare if that was one of your troopers, right? That would be a nightmare for you.
Well, I mean, not just our department. I think the state of Michigan. I think any citizen living here, for sure.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
100%. So we have to realize that, like, although craziness can happen, and that was a form of it, and there are extreme examples that you could find. If you wanted to go on YouTube and type in police brutality, you can try to tell yourself a story of what policing really is that is far from reality. But when we get back to, we're trying our best to train people, we're trying to promote growth, we're trying to give officers the tools to be mentally and physically capable of handling this job, we're going to move things in a better direction. I think you hit the nail on the head back to the fact that, like, we probably do a phenomenal job at the beginning, but now, like, if we applied the attention to, like, you guys are officers probably for life. If they buy in and they wear that pride in that uniform the way that you do, and they suit up, they're going to be in it for life. And the more that we can provide an ongoing process and system for those people to be successful, the better the community is going to embrace it. And I love Michigan. Like, I live here now. It's my place, so I just have a pride for it. But I want Michigan to be the gold standard for everything. And you probably feel that way about the Michigan State Police. Like, let's be the gold standard for this country and look at things through a fresh set of eyes and say, okay, let's not just pat ourselves on the back and say we're doing great here. How do we be the best?
So we get into this conversation a lot, right? What does success in the MSP look like? And years ago, it was measured in number of tickets or the number of arrests or any other number of measurable that you would normally associate with policing. In this day and age, I don't know that you would go to a member in our department and if you ask him, hey, do you want the MSP to be the best? I would be shocked if somebody said no. I mean, me as a leader, of course, I want our agency to be the best. The trick is figuring out what is success in modern law enforcement. What does that look like? And I think a lot of it is narrative, and it's hard to measure. It's hard to measure what safety feels like and when your citizens feel safe and people are safe on the roads, or they don't have to worry about their house or their car getting broken into or their child being a victim.
You are so correct, because as you were listing those metrics, in my brain, I was literally thinking none of those things matter in the way of, like, how well are you doing your job? Because you could be writing whatever number of speeding tickets, but be treating citizens horrifically, be abusing force, be abusing their rights, or the same exact number or less than or more, but doing a phenomenal job communicating, carrying out the law the right way, having emotional intelligence, having compassion. Like you said, one of the first things, I want my officers to have compassion. Those are the things that measure how successful you are versus that old mindset of, like, how many tickets do we write? That doesn't tell you anything about how well you're doing your job. So even just to sit with a leader like you that is able to see it from that light gives me such a good hope for the direction we're heading, because absolutely, what does that matter? What matters is, like, how do the citizens feel about you? When someone's son says, I'm thinking about joining the Michigan State Police, how do the parents feel? How does the community feel? How about their daughter? That right there, that is a measure of how Michigan State Police is doing.
Yeah, I've sat across from a number of parents who say, well, what do you think? Do it. But they have to want to do it. But if they're interested, encourage them to do it. I don't know any other way to put it.
But that's where we're going, right? Is like we're trying to get to a place where policing is once again looked at as like a wonderful thing. I grew up in that world. When I was a little kid, I bought in fullest to the fullest of this country. I learned all my amendments. I learned my rights. I was all sold. I love police officers and firefighters and professional athletes. Those were like, as a kid, like those are the things you go like police, firefighters, professional athletes. And we can move it back to that. We can get the next generation to be like, man, like thank God we have the best police in the nation. That can be the standard. So I guess the last topic I want to talk about before we wrap the podcast up, we're over an hour, by the way, with easy dialogue.
Okay.
We're just crushing it. What are your goals? Because you're someone that now has a very powerful spot within the Michigan State Police. You're a leader. You are connected to the people that can really move the pieces. You know what I mean? Like you're not that beginning trooper that might have these awesome ideas, but you're not up the ranks yet. You haven't had enough time, and you can really move things in the right direction. What are your goals with the Michigan State Police?
It's interesting you asked me. I don't know how to answer that question. Because part of it is I never thought I would be in the seat that I'm in today. It didn't exist a couple of years ago, but I came into the state police because I felt like they were the best. And I felt like if I'm going to join an organization and spend a career with them, I want to know that they're the best and that they lead in a lot of areas. And I would tell you we still do. Waking up every day as a leader and getting the good fortune to lead the 3,200 men and women we have around the state, my goals are short term. I wake up every day wondering, can I make an impact on a trooper today? Can I make an impact on a civilian today? That might be as simple as just sending them an email, hearing about a great case that they closed, or, they pulled a driver out of a drainage ditch in an overturned car, or, hey, they prevented a child from being exploited on the internet. If I can make an impact on a trooper that day, then my job is worth it, right? I honestly don't know what step is next. People will say, oh, you're going to be the colonel. That is a lot of luck and political appointment, and if I never get there, I'm going to be okay. But if I sit in this seat, if I sit in another seat, if you told me tomorrow I was going to be a trooper in the department again, I would be like, oh, hell yeah. I would love to go back to investigating stuff and doing that type of thing, but I'm so fortunate to find myself getting to lead those people who are doing those investigations.
Well, I tell you what, that's the person we need as colonel. You need someone with that type of spirit and that type of energy that's just bought in, that's not working towards a big goal. You're in it, and you're living it, and you believe in it, and you're trying to make a difference. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that. I love that answer. I love the fact that you're like, you know what? I'm just trying to make a difference in something that I love. You know what I mean? And that, it's so obvious. I've known you for now an hour and a half, but it's so obvious how much you do care about what you do and the standard at which you do it. You're not just doing it to do it. You're trying to get to that high level. And that's amazing. I realized there was one topic that I did want to cover that I never even went to, but some of the reform that was taking place during all the outrage and all these things, I actually think was going to lead us in a really bad direction. I've been interested to hear our police officers' opinion on this. Like after the George Floyd incident, I remember in New York, they were coming up with laws with people that are not police, that are just sitting behind a desk, coming up with an idea on how you should do your job of like, when you detain a suspect, like you can't put weight on the suspect's chest. You can't do these things and you do these things. I think there's a really slippery slope that people need to understand that like, even if a terrible incident takes place, you can't take away someone's ability to do their job effectively, or you're going to make more disastrous situations. And what I mean by this is, I imagine, let's say a female police officer that's 120 pounds, who has a 220-pound angry man coming after her that's on drugs. She is going to have to use so much force if he attacks her, and possibly, maybe even probably, her weapons or taser or things like that to de-escalate the situation if she doesn't have to take his life. This idea that we can do policing, like if someone physically comes to attack you, and it's like, oh, well, you have to restrain them, but you cannot put weight on their chest. This is unrealistic. These are standards that I actually think would make police interactions become way worse, Because I'm going to tie this into jiu-jitsu. As a jiu-jitsu coach, I'm proficient at boxing. I'm proficient at kickboxing. I fought professionally in MMA. I'm a good wrestler. So if I have all those skill sets and you come at me, if I use jiu-jitsu, I can neutralize you, put you in a position where you're unable to harm me, stop you from hurting yourself or me, handcuff you, and handle the situation. If I chose to use my boxing skills, I would have to beat your face and body until you stopped coming after me. And if I chose to use my weapon, I would have to shoot you. It would be better for me to use weight on your chest, weight on your neck, put you in a position where I'm in control of you to stop the situation than have to escalate it. So do you believe that when police are doing their job, they should have the ability to make decisions like when it is time to use force and have confidence that they're not going to be, hung out to dry? That's where I'm going with it. Because when I was reading all these articles and these things, I was like, can you imagine being a police officer that is going to be afraid to detain a violent suspect in a certain way for fear of the consequences, or if someone is filming that interaction, you're going to lose your job or you're going to have outrage after you? You're almost going to resort to a worst case because you're going to let things go way beyond where they should have, because the first level might have been able to handle it, but you didn't want to do that because you don't want to harm the suspect, and now it ends up all the way down here. Do you think that's like a dangerous slope for us to go down?
So I think you're talking about several things, and they're all really complicated. But the point that you hit, police officers are routinely called on to make split-second decisions, right? And there are a lot of pieces that work behind the scenes when and I can't speak for other states and all that stuff. I can speak for Michigan. But there are some pieces, case law, that's out there that guide a lot of things that police officers can and can't do. And one of the standards that they hinge on is objectively reasonable. That phrase is ambiguous enough to allow for those circumstances where you may have a small stature police officer who has a 280-pound former NFL defensive end, who is having a bad day. What I will tell you in Michigan, our experience here is that, we have a very supportive legislature. We have a very supportive governor. And one of the things that we were fortunate to do in this last couple of years is sit down and have some policy discussions, right? Are there things that we can do better? And as a leader, you have to be aware of the policy and the standards that you set for your people. Are there gaps? Are there things that we could do better? And we did change some policy because we did have some gaps. And had it not been for this environment, I don't know that we would have noticed them. But I would argue now that police under current case law have an appropriate amount of discretion to be able to take the action that they need. Now, that doesn't mean that, and I can tell you from talking to troopers in our own department, that I think the environment for them has created situations where sometimes they feel paralyzed about what if I do the wrong thing?
That's exactly what I was trying to get to, is because I was putting myself into the shoes of, like, if you're terrified that, like, what if I end up being the one in serious trouble just trying to make this incredibly difficult situation to control? That would be worst case scenario. If you had troopers out there paralyzed to make a decision when you need them to be able to do that. And that's what I was fearful of. But you would say our governor has been extremely supportive in trying to structure things in a way that is supportive for police to do their job while helping the community.
We've been really fortunate. We've been fortunate with the legislature, with the governor, even with other law enforcement agencies here in Michigan, that it's forced us to take a look at our policy, how we train, and not to say that we still don't have work to do, but I think we're in a better place than we were a year and a half ago, honestly. Again,
that's
doesn't mean it's easy to recruit, but I would tell you that as an agency, I think we're in a better place than we were a couple of years ago. We have stronger policy. We've put a couple hundred troopers in uniform, new troopers, but I would tell you I think we're in a better place.
So my last question for the podcast, Amy, is if there's somebody on the outside that maybe could play a role to help with the training, like for me, for example, I train professional athletes. I've dedicated my entire life to training people in jiu-jitsu, and we have multiple FBI families here, a CIA family, DEA, ATF, Michigan State Police, local police. If there are people out there that could play very, very helpful roles in helping the training processes of our troopers and our police and these systems, what are the routes to go through, or like what would be the procedure to get something where you could even just like show your value to a group? Because like one of the things I've struggled with for a while is like, I don't know how I could even get in front of the right people to offer training, to try to push the needle in the right direction, to get in, I would love to meet, even the person that does the combatives training for Michigan and see what level they're on. Not in a disrespectful way, but I would love to, like, if I could provide a tool and assistance, help to a system that wants to be the gold standard, and me excluded, what are the processes? Because it seems like with anything, there's always bureaucracy, or there's decision makers, or there's paperwork, or how do you get something in front of someone that makes the actual call to go, you know what? This will help us, so we're going to give it a shot.
So there's a couple of parts to it. One, the baseline standard for what academies teach is established by MCOLs. No matter where the police academy is, MSP, community college, DPD, MCOL sets the basic curriculum standard. Now, beyond that, when you talk about getting out of recruit school, what does an agency do to train? That differs. I think we're 600 plus police agencies in Michigan. Every one of them trains their police officers different after an academy.
So they're almost independent. They're like independent locations after the academy?
Absolutely, yeah. Your agency is responsible for training you. Now, that doesn't mean that, like in the case of the state police with our defensive tactics unit, we send our subject matter experts out to train with all kinds of different people. We bring people in-house all the time. But those subject matter experts wear a lot of hats. There are use of force experts. They have to testify in court. So it's not just a practical application. It's curriculum development. We have to have curriculum vetted. And then from a risk perspective, you have to look at it as an agency, like, okay, what are we teaching our people? What are we teaching them to do, not do? Does this coincide with policy? So to your point about bureaucracy, there are some pieces there that are important. But if you're trying to get in front of the right people, again, I can speak for our agency. Our training, now our professional development bureau handles that. We bring in people all the time. We're not our own organic experts in bringing in and developing our own curriculum. We have to rely on outsiders to do things. So if it's a roundabout way of asking me, can you get in there? I could probably help you out.
Well, I mean, just meet the right people. You know
Sure.
what I mean? Because I believe I can provide an incredible service that would make me feel like I'm making a difference. That if it got to the right people, will make a tremendous difference. And then really, if we're just trying to push standards, like that's the goal. You know what I mean? Is like to try to elevate the standards of our community, of our police, of our people, the same way I'm trying to do for people in here and the same way you're trying to do within the organization. I feel like the more people we put in place that have valuable things to offer, the better we're able to do so. So, Amy, it was a pleasure sitting with you today. It was awesome getting to know you. Is there anything else in this moment in time you'd like to capture on the podcast? Just anything at all? If not, we'll wrap this thing up.
No, I appreciate the invite.